Hello, everybody. We are at the Warrior Project, and I'm here with Linda Williams, and I'm Don Counts, and we have Dr. Farris Beasley today. Dr. Beasley, thank you for coming.
Well, thanks for inviting me. This is an honor for me to do this. I wasn't in the military, but I graduated from high school in 1953. That's the month that the Korean War was over. So I was not in that group. But I have a lot of relatives that were in World War II, and I've always been a World War II buff. I was born here in the county, Petersburg. Left when I was 5 years old. Folks moved to Nashville. I was raised in Nashville. Spent all my summers on my uncle's farm, some of whose relatives are on these walls in here, and came back after vet school to practice veterinary medicine here for 41 years. Been retired a few years and still around.
Talk about veterans in general, your initial feelings toward them.
Well, you can't say enough about them. They're the ones that made our country what it is. Starting with the Revolutionary War and all the way through, my hat's always been off to them. I appreciate what they do. They're all, as far as I'm concerned, volunteers that stepped forward to preserve our country.
Let's talk about some specific ones you want to talk about.
Alan Moore, I think he's kin to you.
Yeah, Alan Moore was my first cousin. Quite a guy. A lot of people around here know him and remember him. Born in Petersburg. His family broke up when he was real young, and he was raised by his grandparents. So my mother and he were raised together and were real close throughout their entire lives. Farm boy. He and my mother were so close, they went to school together. And he had unlike a lot of country boys, he had a horse and buggy, and he drove them to school every morning, Petersburg. And that was a pretty cool deal. Parked their buggy at their aunt's house, and so they grew up really close. Alan, as he grew older, got a break and got a job in Memphis. His uncle, Warren Gill, had worked in Memphis at a hardware store. And he got Alan on with a pretty good sized hardware company in Memphis. And Alan trained and became a traveling salesman. That is, he went around Arkansas, West Tennessee, Mississippi, calling on the hardware stores. And he was quite a successful salesman. And World War II came along, and he was drafted and went into the quartermaster corps, which was kind of cool because he was a salesman. And the quartermaster corps, took care of all the needs of a soldier outside of their arms. Their toothbrush, their razor, their clothes, all shoes, all that. So that's what he did. And he was not in the Battle of the Bulge. He wasn't trapped in the Battle of the Bulge like the 101st Airborne was, but he was one of the first groups to come in before they were liberated. The 101st was surrounded on Christmas Day, 1944, I believe it was, by the Nazis' last big push. They thought they could finally push them out of Belgium, and they thought they had a chance, and they hit them with everything they could. Surrounded the 101st Airborne. Christmas Day, which was kind of a unique day, I guess, for the Nazis to attack because they knew the guys had their thoughts on home and probably had a Christmas dinner. And so they attacked that day. The weather was unbelievable, one of the coldest winters in European history. And the paratroopers were not issued overcoats because they jumped out of airplanes. You couldn't jump in an overcoat, and they were never issued overcoats. So they didn't have proper winter wear, and they literally froze to death. So when Alan got close to them, he was in a semi-trailer with all their goods, and as they got close, the thing wasn't over with. They were still surrounded, and the quartermaster personnel didn't have any arms. They weren't issued pistols, rifles. So here they are next to the front line with no arms, and they said, just pull your butcher knives out and put them in your belt. That's pretty remarkable.
Yes,
yeah,
it is.
Wasn't it? So anyway, he got through that. I was trying to think of some other things about the war. Oh, he was a farm boy, grew up on a farm, that was his life. And he was a real people person. So when he got into Belgium, type person he was, he got in with one of the farm families in Belgium. They milked cows, man and his wife and a couple of children. And Alan kind of got close to him, so they adopted him. And instead of sleeping in a tent like the other soldiers, he and his buddy slept in the house with those farmers. She fed him breakfast and supper, and and Alan could have pulled something like that off because he was such a people person. And the Belgians, they were a little bit smarter than our farmers over here. They had their cows in the basement, and of course they stayed down there day and night. And of course you had a manure pack there creating heat, and the cows created, and that heated the house. So he had a bed to sleep in, a heated house, 2 meals a day, and that's the way. And that's
Wow.
Alan, he could pull that off. Yeah, he was a people person. Came back here, still traveled most of his life, ended up retiring, had a farm in Petersburg, and I spent several summers with him on the farm, and we were pretty close too.
Awesome. What about the football player?
Well, now that's William Gill.
Okay.
And
okay.
And you probably need to let his family
Okay.
cover that.
All righty. Can you talk about Bobby Williams for us?
I'll try. Bobby was probably in early high school when I came here in 1959 out of vet school. And I got to know Bobby fairly early because he was a horse guy. And he wasn't just a horse guy. At an early age, today you would call him a horse whisperer. He understood horses. It's a God-given gift, and he did. And I remember one time he walked from his house out there on 64 to the stockyard where I was testing cows, and brought his crippled horse for me to look at between cows. And I treated a lot of his horses. And one of the remarkable stories about Bobby, Judge Templeton, everybody knows him, he had a rogue horse, a killer horse that nobody could handle. And a killer horse is a unique individual. When you go in his stall, he comes at you to kill you. Ears laid back, teeth bared, strike you with his front feet. And Bobby had heard about this horse, and he went up and talked to Judge Templeton and said, "I'd like to see your horse." And he saw him, and he stepped, and the story I got is he kind of stepped in, the horse didn't attack him, he just kind of stood back because the horse understood that Bobby understood him. But, it's kind of a two-way street. And Bobby asked the judge, "What do you take for the horse?" He said, "Take for the horse, and I'll give you the horse." He said, "Nobody can handle it. Take the horse, he's yours." And Bobby took him home and broke him. And he did have that unique way with horses. And another story I heard about him, I didn't actually see this, but we've always had Sunday horse races at the fair. Mm-hmm. And Bobby was involved in some of those. And this particular story, Bobby showed up, and of course these were Western guys racing quarter horses, and they all had on the hats and the jeans and the boots and the big belts.
And the big saddles.
And the big saddle, and Bobby had on a T-shirt, I think.
No, he had on a pair of pants. No socks, no shoes, no shirt. I don't even think he had underwear on.
Well,
and barebacked.
Okay, you're adding to the story. You know as good as I do. When he showed up with the other guys, the boys and girls laughed at him because he was such a backward countryman. And he wasn't dressed like he's supposed to be dressed to race horses at Sunday afternoon at the fair. But they lined up, gave the signal, and Bobby smoked them. His horse smoked. And the story I got, when he came across the finish line, he was barebacked, barefooted, no shirt, maybe a ball cap on. But that was Bobby.
Yes, it was.
And then, of course, better than this, a story of his Marine career. He wanted to go into the Marines right after high school. And Bobby was born to be a Marine.
He was.
Yeah.
He
And
absolutely
he
was.
was assigned to the Washington, what do you call that?
Honor Guard.
Honor Guard. They were at Arlington for the burials, and he stood beside John Kennedy's coffin when he was assassinated. And when John F. Kennedy was president, of course, his brother Bobby was Attorney General, and he had a little farm. And I think Bobby had 4 or 5 children, Catholic, of course, and these small children, and he had a horse, and he'd heard about Bobby, and he got Bobby to come out there and teach his children how to handle horses and ride horses. And the story I got, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but this one particular day he was out there with me. Did he drive a Volkswagen?
He had a Volkswagen.
Had a
yes.
Volkswagen. He was out there with the children, and it was hot, and he decided to carry them to town to get them ice cream.
Well, Ethel brought finger sandwiches out to eat.
Okay.
And Bobby was a strapping guy, so he was still hungry after she went back in. And he told the kids he was going to go get a hamburger.
So he puts them in the
Yes.
Volkswagen and take off to town. And when he gets back, the Secret Service was there, and Ethel was beside her. Said, I think, tell him, Bobby, you were not supposed. We're under Secret Service guard, and you were not supposed to take these children away.
She told him, said,
Yeah.
it's okay this time,
Yeah.
but next time just tell me where you're taking them.
And then, of course, and then after Kennedy was no longer president, Lyndon Johnson was president, and Bobby got in with him, I think, fairly close, and dated his daughter.
He did, but he dated her when he was a page
When he
in
was
high school. He dated her.
Okay.
I found a diary of his where he had listed his expenses, and he had 25 cents transportation to Lucy's house.
Now, was Lucy the older girl?
I think so.
She was a real attractive
Yeah.
brunette.
Yeah.
Now, did he date her as a Marine or anything later
No.
on? Okay. And the story I got was he wanted to go to Vietnam.
He volunteered.
He was stationed in Washington, and he wanted to go to where the action was. And that was Bobby.
Yeah.
So, and the story I've heard also was that Lyndon Johnson told him, said, you don't have to go to Vietnam. I can send you anywhere in the world you want to go. And he said, I want to go to Vietnam.
He did.
And when he got over there, they had set up a plush job for him.
He was the CO driver. CO's
Driving
driver.
the Marine Corps commandant. And as I understand it, the Marine Corps commandant was a tough guy to work with, not well liked. And Bobby wasn't happy doing that job when he wanted to be on the front line.
Right.
And he finally got transferred, and it was a point man. How long did he live after he was shot?
3 days.
3
He was
days.
wounded the 23rd of February, and he died the 26th.
Well, and then I heard the nurses were so attached to him.
They were, but you,
Because-
knowing him, would understand.
Yeah,
that.
with the and the type person he was, you can understand it.
One of the doctors wrote Mother and told her that he said there was not a dry eye on this ship when he passed, and he said that if I had a child, if I ever have a boy, I would like for him to be just like your son,
Well,
because that was just Bobby.
Bobby was one of a kind.
He was.
He lived a full life.
He did.
Every day.
I've been so thankful. Not only did he live a full life here in town, but he got to do med cruises in the Marine Corps. He visited lots of countries in the world,
Yeah.
and I'm in the process of going to the countries he visited.
Really.
Yes,
Really?
I am.
That's
yes,
amazing.
I am. One of the guys that he was friends with that I've hooked up with on Facebook told me when we were in Italy, we got lost in Venice because their streets are so weird and you run into water and all this. And I put that on Facebook, and he messaged me back and said, your brother and I got lost in Venice too.
Really, really. That's about the stories I have about veterans. One other thing of interest, I guess, I was 6 years old when Pearl Harbor happened, 9 years old on D-Day. So I grew up a World War II history buff and was always fascinated by World War II, read all kinds of books, and had a desire to go to the Normandy beachhead. And I guess about the time I retired, Philip Higgins' son was involved in some kind of tour guide in Washington, and I said, get me a really good tour to the Normandy beachhead, and he apparently got me the best one you could possibly get. The tour guide on the bus was a retired history professor at West Point, and he had spent his entire adult life studying the Normandy campaign. The campaign was 6 weeks before they broke out of the hedgerows and headed towards Paris. And the tour director was on the bus with us also. He was raised in he was Austrian, raised in the same town as Hitler. And between the two of them, they knew everything there was to know about the Normandy campaign. Every morning when we got up, before we got on the bus, we went to the conference room at the hotel and had an hour lecture on what we were going to see that day. We spent a week over there, 4 days and 4 nights on the beachhead at the little towns. It wasn't a tourism trip. It was a serious military trip. We saw 6 military museums, and when we pulled up in our bus to the museum curator came out and gave us a personal lecture on the bus, and then took us in and changed the French film to the American film and gave us a personal tour through the museum.
Oh,
it was unreal. We went to 2 cemeteries, the American Museum at Pointe du Hoc and the British Cemetery, the American Cemetery at Pointe du Hoc and the British Cemetery. British Cemetery was unbelievable. The parents had a little quote on each tombstone about their boy.
Oh, gosh.
It was tough to read. But the American Cemetery, we went there, and I Pointe du Hoc, it's where the Rangers climbed the 200 feet up to get those 2 giant naval guns that they knew they had to take out. And all those guys were ROTC guys from Texas A&M University under the direction of Colonel Rudder, who later became president of Texas A&M. And they have an unbelievable museum there about the Normandy invasion, which I've never gotten to see, but I've always wanted to. They had rifles that shot a hook with a rope up to the top, and they climbed that hook while the Germans were shooting down them. 285 of them went up. Next morning, only 85 of them answered roll call. And when they got up there, the guns were gone. They had moved the guns several months before, 5 miles back, and covered them with camouflage netting. And of course, as soon as they found them, they blew them up. But
Wow.
And the tour of the cemetery was unbelievable, just very touching. He said there was a sidewalk and a wall with all the names of all the ones that had died at Normandy. And there was a grassy area about 10 feet wide and 40 feet long, 1,500 body parts buried. Unidentified body parts were buried there. And of course, those markers, those marble markers, are set up so that they're perfectly distanced from every direction, and they're straight this way, and that way. And it's just an unbelievable sight. All of the marble tombstones only have 2 things on them: the soldier's name and where he's from. And he said, "Now I want you to go down here and look at this particular grave." And it was a honor. What's the biggest honor that you can get? The Medal of Honor.
Medal of Honor.
It was President Teddy Roosevelt's second son that was the only general that landed on the Normandy beachhead. Eisenhower had given orders, no generals go in, because he knew it was going to be a bloodbath. He didn't want to lose any of his generals. And this General Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt's son, came to him and said, "This ain't right." He said, "I've worked with these guys every day. I'm going in with them." And he did, and he wasn't killed, but he died of a heart attack 3 weeks. He was 55 years old. Died of a heart attack 3 weeks after the invasion.
Oh, wow.
And he was buried there. And they said, "I want you to look at the grave next to him, that was his older brother that was killed in World War I in Belgium. Teddy Roosevelt lost two sons in one in the First World War and one in the Second World War, and they're buried together, side by side. They disinterred the older brother where he was buried in France somewhere and brought him there.
Wow. You were telling me the other day about a book that you had just read.
Oh yeah, it's a book written by a veterinarian who just graduated from Texas A&M, and he was in charge in World War II of 2 platoons of dogs that went with the Marines. When the Marines finally left the Philippines and started that island hopping towards Tokyo, the losses were unbelievable. As they landed, of course, the Japanese were shooting back, and the landings were just atrocious. And then after they finally got on the beachhead, the Japanese would go back up on the hill and hide in the caves in the mountains. And we weren't used to fighting that guerrilla warfare. The Japanese would come out at night, kill the guards, and the next morning you'd find the Marine guards dead. Didn't even know they'd been killed. They'd come out 100 at a time and wipe out a whole Marine platoon at night. And some old Marine sergeant said, you know, this ain't working. We got to do something better than this. We need some dogs. And the Marine Corps commandant, he didn't think anything of it. He said, that'll never work. But they tried it. And this vet was in charge of 150 sentry dogs. They were taught to identify 5 different kinds of mines, pick up the Japanese scent, and alert the handler and the platoon behind them, we're walking into a trap. And those dogs were so good. When the Japanese would start down the mountain in the middle of the night, the dog would sense it and point his nose where they were coming from. And the Japanese learned that, and they started shifting back and forth as they came down to try to confuse the dog. When they'd shift this side, the dog would turn this way. He knew exactly where they were coming from. When they'd go to the other side, the dog would turn that way. And as they got closer, he knew exactly when the time to step out and drop them was. The handler and the dog were always in the front of the squad on patrol. About 40 handlers died, and about 35 dogs were killed. But they started after the training at Fort Lejeune, Camp Lejeune, and then Camp Pendleton, California. They went to Guam first. That was the first island they were used on. And they couldn't believe the difference. They said thousands of Marines were saved by those dogs. The dog would know instantly when the Japanese was hidden in the grass right there, and it was just amazing.
That is amazing.
Really neat book.
Yeah,
really neat book.
I want to read it.
Yeah, they got the dogs from ordinary citizens, 150 of them, German Shepherds and Doberman Pinschers, and trained them to do those 3 different things: sentry, bomb detection, and something else they did. But when the war was over, they detrained those dogs. They made them unsoldier-like because they were so vicious, and they'd been trained to be fighters. They had to untrain them to give them, and they gave them back to their people that sent them, which was pretty neat.
We had one of our 5 that we lost in Nam. Dale Armstrong was a dog handler.
Really? Wow. This
sure
guy
was.
that put up our Kemp Blunt statue, after he did our statue, he did a Korean Vietnamese dog handler and his dog, and it was put up in his hometown, and 40 dog handlers from Vietnam showed up when they dedicated it, and he said that was the most emotional thing he'd ever been in.
I can imagine.
Yeah, it was neat.
I can
And
imagine.
a lot of those Marines got to take those dogs home. If the owner didn't want them back, they took a lot of them home. That's about the end of my story.
That's awesome.
All right. While we've got you, people will be watching this all over the world. Tell them about Camp Blunt. Tell them where we are and the history behind it and what you are expecting in the future.
Okay, and I'll try to make it short, but Camp Blunt was a muster site for General Andrew Jackson during the War of 1812. And what had happened to bring it about was the Creek Indians were involved in a civil war. England and the U.S. had re-attacked after the Revolutionary War was over. They declared war again against each other because the British were stopping our trading ships, taking our sailors off, and they were also bombarding our ports to cut down on our trade. We were a broke country, barely needed money to trade with Europe. And so they bombarded Boston Harbor, shelled it, bombarded Baltimore Harbor, landed, burned the White House, burned the new national capital, got back in their boats. Instead of going back home, knowing that they really could never take America, everybody had a gun. Everybody in America had a gun, so they knew they couldn't take our country. But instead of going back home to England, they went to Jamaica. Now, why did they go to Jamaica? They went to Jamaica to train for the landing of New Orleans and to take New Orleans, turn it into a British colony, and control all the commerce on the Mississippi River. Mm-hmm. And then they did, and so Fayetteville wasn't involved in that. So how was Fayetteville involved? Fayetteville was involved because the British also armed the Indians on the frontier. We were the frontier. So they armed the Creeks. The Creeks wanted to send a message to President Madison that they were not going to give up their land. They were not signing any treaties. They were not going to any reservation. They were going to die first. So to get the message across, they attacked a little military fort at Fort Mims, killed 250 men, women, and children. 1,000 braves attacked at dawn, wiped out the whole little military encampment. And of course, when President Madison heard about that, sent word to the governor of Tennessee. Why Tennessee? Because we were the frontier state nearest to where it happened. There was no Alabama, no Mississippi, no Louisiana at that time, so it was up to us. The governor in turn called on Lieutenant General Andrew Jackson to call forth the militia and volunteers and to meet on the south side of the Elk River below Fayetteville, which was later called Camp Blunt in honor of the governor. So they met there and left the campsite on October the 11th, 1813, to go to the Creek Indian War. They called for 2,500 volunteers, and there's two different figures used in history. One's 3,500 showed up, one's 4,500. I like the 4,500 figure because it's bigger. So 4,500 volunteers and militias showed up, and the next week the Nashville paper, for the first time in history, used the term Tennessee the volunteer state. And General Jackson kept a diary during the Creek Indian War and later the Battle of New Orleans, in which he used the term several times, my Tennessee volunteers. So we think Camp Blunt was partial home of the term Tennessee the volunteer state and Tennessee volunteers. So that's why we kind of wanted to put that statue up. That statue, the name of that statue is the Tennessee Volunteer. It's not anybody. It's just represents, that is dedicated to the first Tennessee volunteers, and not only the first ones, but all the volunteer soldiers since that time who stepped forward to serve our country. So that's kind of what it is. After they left to go to the Creek Indian War and ended at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, the victory was so unbelievable. Madison was so impressed. They killed 900 Creek Indian braves, and he lost 45 soldiers. Madison made him a lieutenant general in the regular army and gave him the responsibility to protect New Orleans. And of course, in December of 1814, they went down there. The British left Jamaica on 50 barges with 14,000 soldiers. Jackson had 4,000. And New Orleans, it's not really on the Gulf. It's 90 miles up the Mississippi River. So Jackson set his artillery up about 3 miles below so that the ships would have to stop there. And he made the British come off in a swamp to get to the battlefield. And Jackson had a 1,000-yard long canal that he had drained and thrown up dirt behind, 4,000 soldiers behind it. And as the British came into the field at dawn, there were 12 cannons that he had on top of the embankment with nobody showing, not even the cannoneers. And as the British got into cannon range. They jumped up there, fired the cannons real quick, just, shot them down wholesale. Of course, the British were marching shoulder to shoulder in that Napoleonic warfare that was in vogue at that time. And they filled in the gaps. Then when they got into rifle range, the first 1,000 soldiers jumped up at the same time, all fired at the same time, dropped back down. And again, they fell like flies, but again, they filled in and kept coming forward. Things were looking pretty bad. The second group jumped up, fired again, British falling like crazy. And at that time, the British general on his white horse, General Pakenham, rode forward like he was supposed to do, sword in the air, exhorting the soldiers to keep advancing. And he was shot in the knee. Horse was killed. He went down, grabbed another horse, and came forward again. This time he was shot in the head, and that was the end of General Pakenham. His second in command did what he's supposed to do. He rode forward same way, sword, and he was shot in the head also. I think at this point in time, the younger officer said, this is not working very well. Maybe we need to head back to our ships, which they did. Jackson, about 300 British were killed, 600 casualties in all, and Jackson lost 11 men, which is pretty remarkable. As far as we know, Jackson did not ever have 1 hour of military training. He was, first of all, a real estate man, plantation owner, and a lawyer. But he beat the general of the greatest army in the world at that time. Pretty remarkable. And that's what Camp Blunt's all about. And we're in the process of development. The state purchased the property about 3 years ago. We had a grant where we've done something. We've got several things done. Our open air pavilion's going up. The rafters are up today. So that's a big plus. That'll be finished by the summer. And every fall, the last weekend of September, we're going to have volunteer days and have living historians down there in period dress. Our goal is to train the young people about the significance of Camp Blunt, and it's it had a remarkable part in American history. Finished the Creek Indian War, had a big part in finishing the Battle of New Orleans, which sent the British back. Finally, one last time, it was all over. So it's something that we need to know about and be very proud of.
Well, we certainly appreciate all the work that you've done.
Well, we got to have a good committee. We had the right people in the legislature and locally, and a lot of interest, and got it done.
Well, we certainly do appreciate that. And we really appreciate you coming today and doing this interview.
We really do.
Glad to do it.
Blunt is in Fayetteville, Tennessee, and we're at the Warrior Project in Fayetteville, just off the square. And we appreciate Dr. Farris Beasley being our guest today, and Linda Williams is here with me, and we will see you next time.
Great.